couple of bits of announcements. I will not be here next week. That's not a problem. Constantine Boyd is doing that lecture on critical designing, critical design. That should be straightforward. The other thing to say is that this talk is directly related to the third assignment that you will get in the next week, this weekend, in the next week, and which basically asks you to do a piece of designing, not, I hasten to add, the studio work, but as the thinking for designing innovation. And you will see that how this lecture completely ties into that. That's what it's about, in effect. Now, let me show the lecture. The lecture itself is going to be a mass of slides. It's mostly visual. For those of you who have complained I don't show enough visual stuff, this is almost entirely visual. And let me explain then why I'm going to do. Really, the lecture in this title is really in two parts. I can't squeeze everything into one lecture, so we have to think of this as the first, and then I will really complete everything in 2 weeks' time. Now, what I'm mindful of is the challenge that I set myself in my last talk, which focused on Riddle's wicked problem, where I said that if wicked problems were to be solvable to some degree by design, then that had to be because the problem somehow contained its solution by design or through design. So I kind of was suggested there that wicked problems are an inverse way of understanding design's potentiality, or better, design's capabilities, and thus, to play off again, to link to the title, but also to play off Von Sieppi's excellent little essay which I gave you for this week, the virtues of design. And I'm increasingly seeing in my own mind this link between the virtues of design and the capabilities of design, and we will pursue that in the next 2 or 3 weeks directly, in fact, too, on November the 21st with Otto von Busch's lecture, which will be about capabilities of design for capabilities. But in this lecture, instead of going through this theoretically, I'm going to try to do it looking through a single coded object, an object which is obsessive for me, as some of you have already realized, which is the London Underground diagram. Although you'll see I will be stretching the word single here, since my object stretches over 18 years. So I'm giving you the LUD for 2 reasons. Partly, as I said, because it's obsessive, but partly because it lets us into some very interesting questions about innovation and about design configuration in a very direct way. In another way, it's also a kind of uncanny object. As you'll see in a second, it's only 80 years old. This means that it belongs to history, that, and yet it is not simply belonging to history, it's part of us now. It's, in a sense, it might even be said to be very much part of the world which James Hunt was describing in his manifesto when he talked about code. He talked about the new world of code. Is not the LUD an exercise in coding? And in fact, I shall say in a minute, is the LUD not a very interesting links together questions of infrastructure, public policy, code in a whole number of senses, and designing. So in this way, this historic object could also be said to be a very contemporary object. And that's my point here, to try to make a flow between history and now and the future, instead of the way that we do rigid divisions. However, so let's begin. And this is just a quotation, quotation about infrastructures, reminding us that infrastructures, as in Paul Edwards' article, are not just physical things, though they are. They're also, as he puts it rather well, the connective tissue and circulatory systems of modernity. And this, I think, echoes perfectly with the London Underground diagram. So, our question, why should we study the LUD? 4 reasons. For 4 immediate reasons, and then some more complicated ones. First of all, longevity, 80 years, which is extraordinary. Here it is in 2013, here in 1964, 50 years ago, here in 1934. So this longevity is not unique, but it's very unusual, especially when we have a basic continuity, which nonetheless mutates considerably. We shall see that this longevity is itself a kind of a virtue, or rather it suggests that the schema of the LUD, or its idiom, possesses some very important virtues. Those are persistence, resilience, flexibility, adaptability, sensitivity. But let's look at another reason. The LUD is the grandparent, as the modern genre of urban mapping transportation systems. Here's Berlin, Madrid, Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, in advance of itself in 2020. And the rather beautiful diagram for the Los Angeles subway system. Thirdly, the LUD is a model for mapping and presenting information in general. The guy who wrote the book on transit maps of the world, of course, used the LUD as his model. It is the grandparent. But it's being used to map in US interstate highways, cycle paths in London. More interestingly, it's been used to diagram the body's major skins. It's called underskin, if you like. System here. This one is mapping the interaction of characters in Shakespeare. A Cambridge academic was writing a book on this and just could not find a way of otherwise doing this. There's some delightful categories here, by the way, too. Fathers and daughters, villains, heroes, strong and difficult women, warriors, fools. Strong and difficult women and the warriors united Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. It was into Shakespeare. This is quite wonderful. This was the only way they could find to actually map this beautiful presentation here. It's been used to illustrate possible routes for tourists around the county of Somerset. Sensible students in Cambridge, England, have devised a series of pub crawls and mapped them for you. You're wonderfully drunk here, or weak. And I walked into my local wine shop the other day, and there are 2 posters for wines of France and wines of California based on metro maps. Not as good as the London Underground diagram, but we get the point. An astronomer has diagrammed, if rather crudely, the Milky Way. Even the annual Web Trend map uses a not very good version of the LUD. And of course, we have the Undocumented. Fourthly, there is its appeal to designers and bloggers. This wonderful poster for the Tate Gallery, which was done to kind of mark the Tate, now the Tate Britain, as now is becoming close, becoming connected to the underground when extending the Victoria line. Very beautiful poster here. This lovely, witty play on the idea of the folder, the handheld tube map. Lines. It's been used as a basis of a Pac-Man game. It's been made into the circuit board of a radio, which links to possibly its origin in electrical circuits. Bloggers cannot resist making variations. There's a mad academic in the University of Essex who makes quality versions. You should be shocked. Some of them, no matter how astonishingly impractical, Young designers are always trying to reinvent a new LUD. This was Mark Node 2 years ago. Thank you, Mark. No. So, including some who seem to be incapable of learning any graphic lessons at all from Halifax masterpiece. Recently, there's been an epidemic of versions that rename stations, beginning with Simon Atherstone's artwork in 1992 called The Great Bear. Some of these, there are saints. The one line is realized in saints. There are footballers, there's philosophers. This is Bertrand Russell, René Descartes, Plato, Arthur Schopenhauer. This must be the saints are going up here again. Art, famous Italians, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Somebody's done a version, if Germany had won World War II, so on the station to mock German. They produced an underground film map. There's a man who has synesthesia, who claims that he can taste every station in London, and he has mapped them all. Heathrow Airport tastes of Eccles cake and fruit gums, Eccles cake and jam sandwich, Eccles cake and jam sandwich, baked egg and peppercorns, boiled egg, wedding cake, etc. But what's perhaps most surprising is the diagram's extraordinary popularity with the general public. And this is the stupidity of software systems. Because I work these lectures on a Mac and a PC both, show them on either and it knocks it out. Anyway, look at this. 60 million commercial reproductions a year outside of London transport. Absolutely extraordinary. The popularity. So there we go. You can completely adorn yourself. I sometimes think I should buy some of these and wear them. Even down to underwear, which I think is a little drastic. I can't imagine the journey lasted long enough to have the romantic liaisons, but who knows. You can even gaze at the LUD from your bath, which this is rather nice actually. I would like to actually buy one of these, but this actually raises an important issue here. Is all of this last bit commercial manipulation, or does the graphic form of the LUD make an intrinsic appeal to us so that we can't help responding to it? Now, I think that's a really genuine question now. Does the appeal lie somehow within the poetics of the configuration, even though there doesn't seem to be any in certain ways? Or is it just manipulation? Open question. And this is a genuine problem with all iconic objects. At first, we do not look at them. As for years with the LUD, nobody paid it any attention whatsoever. The first critical writings do not happen until the 1970s and 1980s. And then when an object passes to iconic status, we no longer see them. The Empire State Building, the Eiffel Tower, all iconic objects. So they're problems, they really are. And yet, I want to insist that the popularity of the LUD is not trivial. And in fact, I think that one problem within design in general is that design is actually not very good at articulating design success. And the LUD is unambiguously successful, 80 years of success. So how does it do it? And I have a feeling that how it does it is much more psychological than we tend to think it is, not simply functional. Now, if we take these first 5 reasons, longevity, influence, model, appeal, popularity, they are themselves sufficient to demand why we should pay attention to it. Longevity raises questions of what the work possesses, such that it can remain relevant and alive across 8 decades. Influence asks about the force of the event that precipitated this continuing sequence of global variations. Model asks about why the schema seems to work so well for a colossal variety of appropriated instances. Appeal asks about the sense of playing with that the LUD seems to introduce. It somehow seems to invite participation. It has the sovereign art of accessibility, as Barthes would say. Finally, popularity testifies to the strange affection in which the diagram is held. Why is this affection? And the peculiar identifications that we can have. But the diagram also induces three further, what I would call kind of meta questions, the biggies, really. The first is about origination. As soon as we reflect on the diagram, we have to ask, how did it come to be? But this is not just a historical question. It is a historical question, but not just. It means asking about what design and innovation and origination are, how they occur, and what enables invention, and what translates invention into innovation. The second concerns design configuration. It's a question of what design achieves, and therefore a question about what design things are and what they do, which I think is always more multivalent and more complex than we want to admit. Thirdly, the third concerns the present, the past, and the future. It's about how the LUD is that which links into the past, but which has a coding concerning connections that is addressed to capabilities, and here I'm echoing Jayla, is part of what is now emergent. Indeed, in some ways, it anticipates. I'm telling you that the LUD is in some way an uncanny anticipation of where we are now. So, let's look at these three kind of questions, and then I'll get back into the LUD. We ask about design innovation because it should already be clear the LUD is arguably one of the great instances of design-led innovation in the 20th century. In my view, perhaps it is the greatest, but I'm obviously biased here. It's comparable, say, to the British Mini, which was in itself, I think, an astonishing innovation. Again, more than 1958 this time. A simple configurative switch, whereby you turn the engine from lateral to transverse, that makes the possibility for really the most effective small urban car. And then my other example, to keep up the British theme, Mary Quantum miniskirt of 1962, which is possibly even more influential than the London Underground aircraft. Has there ever been a greater revolution in clothing and the body in the last 100 years? And let's remember, this was not negligible. Here, a simple reduction. You cut a skirt. You take a foot off a skirt. And look what it does. A whole attitude to the body changes. And look, attitudes that were emergent around 1960, the skirt actually in a way actualized and to some extent gives license for new attitudes to be represented, to be expressed. It is nothing at all, and it is everything. And look here in those two photographs, it even expresses a class shift from middle class fashion to something like working class, not exactly working class, more like non-class. But look at those two bodies. Tweedy could not be in the 1950s. You see what I mean? So, design configurations, tiny but make a difference. Now it's worth noticing that all these innovations, let's think about this, the sort of economics here, they've all been around for more than 50 years, continually working. They were astonishingly economically successful. They're cheap to invent, give a massive return on design investment. Each one is paid back in terms of thousands of percentage, even the minute. There were 5.5 million made in its first production run, and it's now still in production. Each one was unpredictable before its origin and obvious afterwards. And that's an interesting condition in itself. What all three have in common is that they're all wholly design or configurative-led innovations. And by this I mean that the innovation comes principally, if not entirely, not from a technological development, but from the configurative reworking of an existing paradigm. So the interesting question is, what makes a design innovation possible? What are the conditions for originating in design? In the case of the LUD, this is all the more interesting in that its designer was not a professional, but a 29-year-old unemployed electrical draftsman, which the little footnote says is just about the position you all will be in when you leave Parsons in 2 years' time. So there is a real connection here. You're looking at somebody who did what you guys are going to have to do. Nobody's going to obviously pay you a salary. So the second question takes up this issue about configuration. If the LUD is a design-led innovation, it means that it depends on reconfiguration. The question is, what does the design configurative work actually do? One answer or one argument might say very little. That in this case, all that Becker's changed is a few lines. But isn't that the point? A design configurative innovation produces a profound phase shift, James' phrase, very important, James' phrase, in the operation of something. Just like water passes to steam but continues to be H2O, so in effect the map is the same, but it's not the same. It operates differently, just as steam operates differently to water, so the diagram operates completely differently. Tiny, minute difference produces astonishingly different outcomes. And all this is made by this lovely, light, transformational gesture. Each of those three big innovations I showed you, a tiny gesture. A bit like this one. If you read the von PSA, he refers in his first paragraph about lightness to this lovely piece of Italian wit, the design from 1957, Castiglione's famous tractor seat. The sudden agile leap of the poet philosopher who raises himself above the weight into the world of cancer. And as we've just seen, this is not necessarily a trivial gesture. This kind of gesture can be critical, provocative, and emancipatory. Those three words, I think, are all important here. In the case of the LUD, the functionality, the popularity, and the design innovation qualities of the diagram rest entirely on its organization, on how it reconfigures, arranges, and details a very small number of elements. And you can read John Walker's superb analysis of the LUD to take you through this. This tells us that the reconfiguration is not just a formal operation, but an act in transforming how something works, and in therefore changing its identity and its conceptual structure, is in that sense much more complex than we might imagine. This simple act is nonetheless unbelievably complex in its consequences and implications. We can go further and say that if the LUD works for its users, even in its most basic sense as a guide to the underground, it's because it develops their capabilities. Most immediately, their capabilities to navigate the unknown subterranean world of the underground. You can get this in this fabulous woodcut that was done about 1926 or so to show the rebuilding of Piccadilly Circus underground. Wonderful illustration. But it can do this, or if it can do this, if it can develop these capabilities, it's because these cognitive capacities are already prefiguratively embodied in the configuration, which means in the visual and conceptual qualities of the diagram itself. So if the diagram works to produce our capacity to navigate, those capacities must be somehow buried in the form of the diagram itself. And this makes the link to the third question. The LUD, as we've just said, to echo James' manifesto, is literally a coding concerning connections that is addressed to capabilities. By extension, does the LUD also code how we can connect and develop capacities to engage with wider systems of technical infrastructure that are becoming dominant today? So kind of the implication is that we go beyond just the diagram to the whole question about how we relate to technical infrastructure. To put this another way, as I've said, we can argue that the LUD is at the nexus of questions of infrastructure, public policy, code, capacities, and the design. So this makes it better. In this case, It also tells us then, to re-emphasize the point I've been making now, that the work it performs is scarcely simple. Calling the LUD just a functional map or a piece of information design won't cut it. The work it does is more complicated, and as I've said before, more psychological. Let's turn now to looking how the LUD came to be, design innovations, which is in fact all we shall have time to look at today. Begin with context, which is where we must always start. And again, remind you of this for your third assignment, which I'm going to give you. Context understood as the source of change and expectedness, the real generator of newness, design, and evolution. This is J.C. Jones in the second subtext. London is its content. By 1900, 6 million persons, then the largest city in the world. That was about the 1840s. London just keeps growing and growing and growing. The huge problem is how do you get around and across a city of this size. By the late 19th century, there are real transportation problems, genuine problems. Traffic jams, literally, horse-drawn traffic, seized up. First underground railway, first one in the world, was developed in 1863. Travel, because it's steam trains, is very unpleasant. They're very noisy, dirty, and yet the urge for travel is such that by the middle of the 1870s, there are already the embryo of a central network. The real expansion comes in the 1890s. Two developments. You have electrical traction, which is much cleaner, smoother, quieter, and the new rotary tunneling machines, and these make possible the construction of tube lines. You can see from this postcard here, the new tube line is selling itself as clean, light, modern. This notion of modern is extremely important, we say. However, it was the system. There was a huge rash of speculation. Lines were built, but of course, costs were higher, traffic was lower than expected. The lines were almost in bankruptcy. By 1914, the system was almost in crisis. A government report at the time, in 1919, to investigate all this, said the problem had become a public scandal. And notice this last sentence. This is not me, this is them in 1919. But because London's public transport system remains in the hands of various private companies, a coordinated solution was impossible. In Britain, they are, of course, going back to privatising the tube system. It means that we shall almost definitely end up in a crisis. The system is saved by government intervention. After 1920, the lines were effectively nationalised. A programme of suburban expansion and modernisation begins. There is not only modernisation of the rolling stock, but major changes in how the system interacts with and recognises the needs of travellers. The transformation of the shack station at Sudbury Town into this, one of the first of the really genuinely modern stations. The announcement, 1931, just at the time when Beck was thinking about the diagram, which is very significant. And look at this. Improved standards and provision for passengers. Eat your heart out with upholstery, leather armrests, a sense of dignity and civilization. Us, right? We do not necessarily advance in civilization. We go backwards. I would give my IT. Sit here quiet. Go through the London suburbs, reading your newspaper. This is just entrances to the subway systems were transformed from dark and damp gateways to the underworld to light and elegant spaces with free circulation. This is the rebuilding of Piccadilly Station 1926. It might not look very modern now, but at the time you can see it was transformative. Stations began to become thought of as single entities involving flows of passengers and trains. Significant for Beck, you'll see later on. Interiors were redesigned. This is a night view of the booking hall at Sudbury Town that you've just seen. Look at this beautiful lighting. It's astonishing. This is an address to the traveller. as you are of some significance. You are not simply a sort of object process. It's very powerful. As early as 1917, there was a new and modernized sans serif typeface developed for the underground, which is still in use, basically. This was designed by Edward Johnson. It's a forerunner of Gill Sans, which in turn was the grandparent of alphabeticals. 1917. Even earlier, under Frank Pick, who was the legendary publicity manager and then general manager of London Underground, the companies had communicated the idea of being modern in the posters they commissioned from artists. By the 20s, these reflect a sense of the dynamism of the city and a real awareness of modern art and modern sensibilities. These are both the early 1920s. Quite wonderful posters. In an age before museums of modern art, there was no Tate Gallery in London at that time of modern art. This was how the public saw modern art. E. McKnight Calfer, the American designer resident in London, utilizing cubism. And look here, Leicester Square rebuilt, and they provide a poster gallery around the walls. It's like an art gallery, station of art. This goes along with a redesigned logo, the opening of the bullseye, which is much more, therefore, much more kind of compulsive to our eye, which rapidly becomes the visible shorthand for the underground. The fabulous poster at right by the surrealist Man Ray, which doesn't even need a words, hardly. And by the 30s, travellers could see a determined use of high-level design input extended even to the most humble objects. This bus shelter, they recently put a couple up in my neighbourhood in Brooklyn, 2013, finally got it. Look at the neat little letter basket. What do I get on 7th Avenue Station? A nasty plastic drone, really big, one on the platform, so everybody throws their garbage in a medieval manner on it. It's just disgusting. This is here. All this was brought together in the dramatic new stations for the Piccadilly line. This is Arnos Grove, about 1935. The designer Charles Holden, along with Pick, had been on the continental tour of Holland, Germany, and Scandinavia in about 1930s. Holden saw Asplund Central Library in Stockholm, came home and rebuilt it in a smaller version in Arnos Grove here. This is creative plagiarism. And this beautiful station for Southgate, 1933, with its wonderful kind of little sort of spaceship. I mean, its modernity is given by the sheer contrast with how archaic the cars are. And by the 30s, middle of the 30s, London Underground is justifiably proud of its architecture. Come and look at us, they say. We're doing something good. Come and take a trip on a Sunday to our stations. And this is a design policy which is also a management policy, which is to say a design policy which is a design management policy, which is a management policy linked to the identity of the underground. So that Adrian Forty, who has written a very good study of this, says this: by 1939, the single most striking characteristic of London transport was that all the parts, every station, bus, train, poster, seat, and litter bin, were identified as the property of a single organisation. So in those terms, this design policy is functional. The whole offers then, to bring it back to wider human dimensions, an almost utopian view of how public transportation should be designed and organised across the city. And you can find actually writings in the 30s by Pick and others. They were very clear about this. This is what they were doing. They were it's kind of a civilizing process, how the public sphere could be organised well. Now, what meanwhile had been happening to how the system was mapped, which is where we sort of see Beck comes in. The first system-wide map was created in 1906 to help to encourage traffic. The lines, the individual lines, got together to inform the passengers and encourage travel. From the beginning, though, as you can see in the cartoon and in this map, there are problems in how to map the subway lines. Conflicting demands for geographical accuracy, clarity and persuasiveness means that the map is not as useful to the would-be traveller as might be supposed, and the cartoon from Punch from about 1912 shows this really perfectly. It's supposed to be helpful, but in fact it really isn't. These problems lead to some inventive attempts to try to get round problems. So these are all done before World War I. Pictorial lines, diagrammatic attempts at diagrammatic lines, exploration somewhere between map and diagram, trying to work out these problems. But as the lines expanded in the 20s and 30s, an almost unsolvable problem occurs. And that is as the size of the network increases, but the dimensions of the map stay the same, the physical dimensions, I mean, the scale has to decrease. This makes the core even more congested. By the late 20s, the problem is becoming acute. In this map, not all the outer lines are shown, but the centre, where 90% of the traffic is all but illegible. And it is, of course, the centre where you need the map most, because you need to know where you interconnect between the lines. You almost don't need the map out in the burbs. You need it for the centre. But there's another problem. Cartographers want to make geographic maps. That means they hate to exclude information, but when they do, when they include everything, what happens? The map becomes incoherent. So the map as map is becoming incoherent for the traveller. There's information overload, and as a result, the map is ceasing to be either truly informative or persuasive. So, to summarise, by 1930, existing maps of the system are not satisfying the needs of travellers, nor are they accurately mapping the expansion of the system as a whole. Specifically, existing maps make it almost impossible to comprehend things quickly, make it difficult to understand connections and interchanges. In Peter Drucker's terms, we have a discontinuity between what is offered and what is needed, and I draw your attention to that term. That's a very useful term, the discontinuity between what is offered and what is needed. This is very often the starting point for design innovation. Finally, the maps no longer fit the emerging modern rational and technological realities and image of the underground system as a whole. So mapping and the needs of the public are moving wide apart. The paradigm map is breaking down. The underground tried to deal with this problem of simplification, but Stingmore's map of 1930, though clearer, sorry, this has just gone a mess, is a confession of failure, the text will say under there. So it's becoming apparent that to have comprehensiveness, this is really the key point, to have comprehensiveness, geographical accuracy, clarity and persuasiveness in a single map is impossible. You can't have all four modes. Okay, 1931, enter Harry Beck. So we're asking now about innovation, how innovation happens, how a breakdown in the paradigm can become a starting for information, and how a designer requires the courage to reframe a problem in a wholly new way. This is really the nub of what we now look at. Beck is our actor, a man who originates the London Underground diagram and works on it for 28 years. He has what sounds like a simple ambition. Looking at the old map of the Underground, it occurred to me it might be possible to tidy it up by straightening the lines, experimenting with diagonals, and placing the stations at regular intervals. In reality, the simple question that Beck proposes is much more complex. But how does breakdown in the paradigm become a source of information? And how does Beck feel able to make the radical shift from map to diagram? A shift that none of his professional peers at that point could actually comprehend. In a minute we'll answer these questions through a narrative about Beck, but I want to consider for a minute what successful design innovation actually requires. We look at Peter Drucker, who is a very good writer on innovation and entrepreneurship. In the 80s he wrote this book. And you can pull out of it two prime conditions, or at least I pulled out two. One is that the need must be understood, the need you're dealing with. And it's not enough to be felt, otherwise one cannot define the specifications for the solution. So you feel a need, but you translate it. The solution must fit the way people undertake the key activity. Above all, it must fit with how they want to do it. This seems to me to be crucial lessons. Drucker adds, it is understanding the world that makes the difference between innovations and bright ideas. Bright ideas are rarely successful as innovations. An estimated less than 1 in 500 patents ever really establishes itself as a successful innovation. Why? Because most patents and most bright ideas almost always occur in a vacuum. In a scientific or technical lab, and ideas conceived in a vacuum, he says, rarely work. They may be internally innovative and coherent, but they often have no resonance with persons or are incongruous when put into the world. The conveyor car plane, which is a real project of 1948, wonderful, but totally impractical. You only have to imagine 17,000 of these converging on Manhattan every morning to imagine the sort of death toll that would be. There'd be no stoplights in the air. Okay. What Drucker is telling us is that a successful innovation is dependent on a wide range in analysis of the total situation in which the new invention is going to work. Without that, the sentence which is obscured by this daft British invention, without that failure happens. The hovercraft, which is a brilliant British invention but a lousy innovation, is a very good example of that. Hailed as a great technological breakthrough when it was done, they forgot to ask who would actually want to actually travel in the hovercraft. There is nobody. In fact, there is a very strong argument to say that it is from the kind of analysis of a situation that true originality springs. That is, creativity comes from how a situation and the circumstances in play around that situation, forces, potentials, resources, are understood in their actuality and in their possibility. There's a nice statement here by Rick Robinson, creativity, an inspired riff on something. But let me look at these 2 points too. First of all, a quotation from Michael Baxendorf, which is a lovely counterfactual quotation to what we think of. Baxendorf says originality does not spring sui generis from the painter's head or through expression on the canvas. He says, no, the painter registers his individuality by his particular perception of the circumstances he must address. And he goes on to say, this is where it is most of all here in the analysis of his environment, which schematically speaking precedes the process of painting, that one can most securely locate an individuality. So this is where originality is. It's how you grasp the world. That's what he's saying. The painter's formulation of the brief, especially if it's a self-given brief, is a very personal affair indeed. That's an interesting challenge. Second way to look at this comes from Chinese thinking on strategy. Here's a paragraph from Francois Julien's little book called The Treatise on Efficacy. He says, 2 notions lie at the heart of ancient Chinese strategy. On the one hand, the notion of a situation or configuration as it develops and takes shape before our eyes. That is to say, the situation as a relation of forces. On the other hand, and counterbalancing this, the notion of potential, which is implied by that situation and can be made to play in one's favor. This is an interesting idea here. So the notion of a situation, which is a configuration of forces, and the notion of the potential which lies there and which can be made to play in one's favor. If we translate that, this means that designing is the play between these moments between the notion of a situation as a relation of forces and requirements, and our understanding of the potential which is implied by that situation when it can be realized by the design. Design in this view then will be the activity where on the one side we assess requirements, problems, and what impedes or makes it difficult, improving or realizing a situation. And on the other, it's that we design so that what we design has itself the capability or the propensity to realize to the maximum all that the situation is capable of. And if we can take this last sentence, and say that there is also here an ethic a la barrière. We have no need for an ethics, but only for a clear vision of the situation or situations. To be faithful to the situation means to deal with it according to the rule of maximum possibility, to treat it right to the limit of the possible, or if you prefer, to draw from the situation to the greatest possible extent the affirmative humanity that it contains. I think that is the most incredible, concise ethic for the design I've ever known. That just is a sufficient ethic for design, period. Now, keep these notions then of innovation as understanding and of grasping the situation, and let's go back to Beck. What do we know about him, and what resources does he have? Both of these questions, what are the factors about his life and resources? For all designers, work from the resources they possess, appropriate, steal, or annex. 1931, Beck is a 29-year-old temporary unemployed draftsman. When he works as an electrical draftsman for the London Underground in the signals office in Acton in West London. He's not trained graphic designer, but later in his life teaches typography and colour design. He's a daily traveller on the Underground. He lives in North London, he works in West London, so when he's in work he spans through London. To which we have to add one more point, that Beck was not commissioned to do the job of the London Underground diagram. It was his own project. He invented the project. Key points we can pull from this. You can guess. One, Beck is a traveller. Which means he's a traveller through the system. He knows it experientially. He understands it as a system which is different to surface travel. With the Underground, what matters is not geography, but the number of stops and how and when you interchange. In a sense, it's a simple world. Secondly, as an employee of the Underground, he's daily made aware of the emerging Underground design policy that connected together the engineering side with design for passengers. Thirdly, that he's not a professional designer is in fact an enormous advantage. And we can prove it by looking at this illustration on the right-hand side there, done by a professional designer, same time as Beck. What the designer is doing is trying to rework the map through graphic conventions of the time. But the graphic conventions don't allow him to rethink the map. So he produces yet another sort of failed compromise. Beck is outside of this world, and this is to his advantage. Fourthly, he has his own resources. By contrast to Gwynne, he draws on different kinds of experience, particularly his work in the signals office on circuits and diagrams. Look at the abstraction of the tracks there. The notion of the track reduced to lines, a pattern in the lines. This is the kind of thing that literally must have been in Beck's mind. Electrical circuits is an electrical draftsman. Are diagrams of flows and resistances. Is this not a very good metaphor for the Underground system, which is flows and where the stations represent the resistances to the flows of the trains? That Beck understood this is shown in this joke Christmas card he did after the LED came out, when he converts the diagram back into an electrical circuit. He did this in Christmas 1934. Electrical circuits not only modeled, flow diagrams were being used in planning stations by 1930s. And Beck might well have understood or been aware of parallel attempts in the 1920s to go from map to diagram, usually in some form of compromise with line between each cube. Sixthly, as we've probably, as you've kind of sensed already, Beck would have been aware of what was happening on the underground. The year that he begins his redesign, they open Sudbury Town as the first genuinely modern station. And Beck will have also been aware that passengers on the underground will be starting to be familiar with and hopefully appreciative of its modernization. Beck might have been also aware that in the early 1930s, attitudes to modern architecture and design were gradually changing in Britain. And up till the 1920s, there had been great hostility to modernity. In the 30s, that begins to break down, especially for areas like entertainment, leisure, transportation, and the new kinds of industries. And it's significant here that London and the southeast in general were particularly open to modern ideas. Given these developments, conversely, Beck must have felt that this type of map, with its sort of genteel-like italic typography and its feel of a sort of massive spaghetti kind of spewed out here, could not possibly convey the idea of a modern and rational subway system. So let's try and summarize Beck's position in 1931. By 1931, when he starts on this process, he has the experience to deploy diagrams, is a grasp of how geometric relations can help clarity and understanding. He has a sense of how a mixture of geometry and flow could be a good metaphor for mapping the underground. And we will have sensed that, at least in theory, the London passenger transport board, the underground, should be open to a modern design solution. Above all, though, Beck understands that it's impossible to have geographical accuracy, systemic comprehensiveness, clarity, and persuasiveness in a single map. He understands that one of these has to go, since what is crucial for the traveller is that the map should be first comprehensive, secondly clear, and thirdly ideally persuasive, should give you the confidence to travel. Then he has to sacrifice the one remaining factor, i.e. geographical accuracy. In short, he has to move from map to diagram. And this is what he does. He abandons geographical accuracy in favour of geometry, of the diagram geometry, severe restrictions on the direction and character of lines, and he increases the size of the central area relative to the suburbs. And this is his first sketch, now preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum. What then happens? He makes a presentation rough, hand-lettered. This must have taken an awful long time. It was very useful for him to be unemployed at this point. He presents it to the publicity department. They reject it. Beck's friends tell him that he's got a brilliant idea. They persuade him to resubmit it, and in 1932, late in 1932, the department agrees to a first printing. Why was it accepted? I think acutely timing and circumstances. By 1932, the system modernization becomes visible, and Beck's diagram, somebody realizes that Beck's diagram is the perfect kind of gateway to the, if you see it on the station there at right-hand side, it's the perfect introduction to the new kind of modernized introduction. 5 years earlier, no way. 5 years later, possibly somebody else would have done it. Beck is time. Beck produces a working proof for the first leaflet. This is late 1932. And then there's the first card folder issued in January 1933. It's worth noting Beck's already made a change here from the stations as blobs, which is almost the obvious way of doing the stations. He realizes that a tick is a much neater, more kind of economic solution. The response of the public, immediate and totally affirmative. This is Ken Garland, who has written the book on Beck and the London Underground diagram. The ordering in January 1933 of 750,000 copies was a remarkable turnaround in the official attitude towards the map. Other printings followed soon after. Why did people take so quickly to this unfamiliar, uncompromising diagram? Garland says, perhaps the answer lies in the fact that it was so obviously useful. People couldn't resist its helpful character, appreciating instinctively that its designer, himself an ordinary tube-travelling commuter, was concerned for their information needs and not for novelty for its own sake. In other words, the travelling public recognized themselves, their needs, in Beck's diagram. The rest, as they say, is history. The first quad royal poster appeared in the late spring, summer of 1933. New printings followed with revised design. Beck changes the colour of one. He swaps the colour on these two lines. This had been red, that had been brown, and he turns it so that the red, the strongest colour, forms the east-west, and then the black is the and you've got a kind of east-west, north-south axis on which you hang the kind of putative geography of the LUD. For the next 25 years, Beck works on the diagram in his spare time for his full-time position as a draftsman with London Transport. He's has to negotiate with the publicity department. Beck was very foolish in that he signed away the rights for his diagram to the publicity, to London Transport. If you ever do a Beck, don't do that. It caused him endless trouble. They then treated Beck as if he was just their paid servant. So he had to fit around their ideas, such as, for example, diamond to changes here. That's not Beck. But Beck undertook a persistent search for improvements. You can see that here. And then we can note that later in life he taught typography and colour design. This tells us that he had a design aesthetic sensibility, that he was aware of form both as an aid to understanding and how visuality and visual care could actually help understanding. Thirdly, experimenting. This rather nice, kind of very Art Deco style version from the late 30s as a way to show expansion of suburban lines. He experimented with expanding the scale of reference. This was a proposal in the 1940s to map all the railways of London surface and underground. It was rejected then, but from the 1970s, 80s has become standard. You will find these maps around in London. He tried to apply the logic of the LUD to other cities. He went to Paris sometime in the 40s. It's thought was appalled that the metro map in Paris came back and did this beautiful diagrammatic version, but unfortunately the Parisians wouldn't take it up. Said it was not for Paris at that time. Now they have Beck-like map. Evolving what I would call a classic form from 1940s onwards, and I think I use the word classic here deliberately. I think there is a parallel, not a direct influence between Beck and, say, Poussin's painting, which is itself an epitome of neoclassicism. Art historians always hate it when I show Poussin in relationship to the London Underground diagram, but I think there is a relation. And then in 1960, tragedy. Hutchinson's design replaces Beck's, and Beck's never works on the diagram again. This is very sad. Beck came into work one day and saw this map, which was taken from his, but completely altered. It's a mess, basically. Whereas Beck's lines flow, and the trains flow seamlessly across, this idiot Hutchinson has these, the trains slow down. You know they have to slow down in order to do this kind of corners, actually. It only lasted a few years before Paul Garbett, who was himself not a graphic designer, went back to Beck's principles and reconstructed the map, though without Beck's involvement. And in fact, what Garbett-Beck is the continuing basis of the diagram today. Beginning in the 1990s, Beck is finally honoured after his death in 1974 for his achievement. Now, I would like to lecture to you for about another 3 or 4 hours, but I can't. I've gotten to 150 slides, I'm going to stop. But I'll just finish by just a few points here, one of the last points. First of all, to share something about the sequence that you've just seen. The way that the LUD is not a design, design, but an approach to design. It's not a thing, but a series of conditions. We might think about this. Secondly, that it's very much determined by principles, by both a conceptual structure and an aesthetic. The first highly pragmatic, the second bound with an ethics. But the approach that Beck takes is astonishingly flexible, resilient, and adaptive. Or rather, the schema or the idiom that he develops is flexible, resilient, and adaptive. Third, this approach is highly sensitive to changing context, sensitive both in the details of how it attunes to context, and sensitive to its abuse to Hutchinson. You could see how, in a sense, it's resilient, in another sense, it's fragile. It's both at once. But then Beck was, put another way, the LUD and Beck are remarkably good at capturing nuance, but then Beck was a typographer and the field where minute details matter enormously. As for the sequence, what it shows is the resilience and persistence in Beck himself, and the force of continuing on a single project over time, something that is sadly very unusual in the design, though are slightly more parallels in art or even in architecture. This notion of continuity. But I want to make one last point to end on, which I'll also make. This is with the other reasons for looking at the LUD. One of the reasons for choosing it was the nature of how it was innovated and who it was innovated by. I jested that you would be akin to Beck when you left Parsons, but in a way that was of course not a joke. The whole point of this lecture, and indeed this course, is that all of you actually can, in a sense, do a Beck, in a sense. The most important lesson from the LUD is that you like Harry Beck, can innovate. When he conceived the LUD, all he had going for him was an idea, some time, his experience as a traveller on the underground, and some insights as to the comprehensibility of diagrams given to him by his work. On this seemingly thin, and it proved sufficient basis, he nonetheless felt able to propose his scheme, to fight for it, sustain it, and create what has turned out to be one of the most popular and enduring designs of the last 100 years. It would be wonderful if some of you, or preferably all of you, could do the same thing. And this time, don't sign away your rights. Just think, if Beck had had 1 cent from every copy of the LUD ever printed, just think how rich he would be. On that happy note where you can contemplate the multi-millionaires, that's it. Okay, thank you.